Okay, so there are 7 elements in the process of communication. The first one is the sender, the second is the message, the third is encoding, the fourth is media or medium or channel, the fifth one is receiver, the sixth one is decoding, and the seventh one is feedback. All right, so these are the 7 elements of the communication process. Without these 7 elements, an effective communication cannot take place. In case of an effective communication, these 7 elements are included in the process of communication. So it starts with the sender and ends with a feedback. It starts with a sender and ends with a feedback. All right, so the sender is the person who sends the information, who shares his idea or opinion with the receiver or the listener. All right, the sender is also known as a speaker. Now I am the sender because I am sharing some kind of information with you all, and you all are the receiver because you all are listening to me. So the sender is also known as a speaker and the receiver is also known as a listener. All right, so the sender is the first element of the communication process. Without the sender, a communication cannot, any kind of communication cannot take place. Then the message is basically the information or the idea or the opinion that the sender wants to share. If there is no idea or if there is nothing to share, then there won't be any communication. There is a sender but there is no message. That means there is no information, there is no content to share. So then that communication won't be able to take place. So there has to be a message. Then the third element is the process of converting our thoughts into words, symbols, gestures. That is known as encoding. So the third element is the process of converting our ideas, which is known as encoding. Converting our ideas, converting the information or the message into words, into gestures, into expressions, into actions. So if there is an idea in my brain, okay, in my mind, and I'm thinking about something, so there is an idea going on and I'm constantly thinking about that particular thing, but I am not being able to express it using the correct words. You won't be able to understand it if I am not using any words or symbols to express my feelings or the information or the opinion. Then the other person won't be able to understand. So encoding is that process of converting the ideas, the thoughts, into words or actions or symbols. Then medium is the passage through which the information is sent. Okay, so letters are considered as a medium, email is considered as a medium, then a telephone, a phone is considered as a medium because these are the sources through which the information can be shared. Then the fifth element is the receiver. Now, there has to be someone who reads the message or who listens to the information or the message. So the person who listens to the speaker or the person who receives the message is known as the receiver. The sixth element is the process of decoding. That means understanding the meaning of the message. Now, if I use a language that you cannot understand, suppose I use Chinese and none of you know Chinese, will you be able to understand what am I trying to say? No, of course, no. You won't be able to understand because you do not know that language. So that is why when we communicate with one another, we need a common language. Without a common language, we cannot communicate with one another. When the sender sends the message, the receiver reads the message and understands the meaning of the message. So that process of understanding the meaning of the message is known as decoding. All right. The last and the seventh element of the communication process is the feedback or response. So it is basically feedback is basically the response or the reply that the receiver shares with the sender. So if there is no response, if there is no reply, if I ask you a question and I do not get any kind of response from your end, then it's an ineffective communication. So in order to complete the cycle of the communication process, there has to be a response, there has to be a feedback, or there has to be a reply. The receiver needs to understand the message and then reply. When the sender does not receive any reply, there might be certain kind of misunderstandings, or there might be certain kind of conflicts. So in order to avoid the barriers, in order to avoid the hindrances, conflicts, misunderstanding, the receiver must send a feedback or a response to the sender in order to uh, communicate effectively, in order to communicate properly. So these are the 7 elements of the communication process. I hope it's clear.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Mehbooba Nazneen. So you want me to explain about decoding? So decoding is basically understanding the meaning of the message. All right, when you understand the meaning of the message, that process is known as decoding. All right, now I am explaining something to you. Now I'm explaining elements of communication. So, uh, if you do not understand what I am trying to say, then you won't be able to communicate properly with me. When I am telling you something, because you understand, you're being able to understand my language, so you are attaching certain meanings to my words, isn't it? That is the simple process of decoding. All right.
Yes, ma'am.
So these are the 7 elements of the communication process. I'll quickly check the chat box if there is any other doubt. Okay, there's no doubt regarding. Okay, Rishita, you want to know about encoding. Encoding is the process of converting our thoughts into words. Now, before I had started this class, I had thought that today I will be explaining elements of communication. I will be discussing this particular topic. If I log in and just keep quiet, will you be able to understand what I am thinking? What I am thinking in my mind? You cannot read my mind. In order to understand, the sender has to convert the thoughts into certain words, into some kind of gestures, into some kind of symbols, into some kind of actions. Without actions, without using any word, the other person, that is the receiver, won't be able to understand what the sender is thinking. So that is why uh, one has to convert the thoughts into words, into certain gestures, into actions, and that's how communication takes place. Rishita, I hope now it's clear. I hope now encoding is clear to you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. So that's all about the elements of communication, but do not be confused. Okay, do not be confused regarding the process of communication and the elements of communication. Okay, so in the process of communication, these 7 elements are included. So ultimately, you have to write the same thing. The process of communication has this 7 elements. All right, so do not be confused regarding the process and the elements. The next topic in this chapter is face-to-face communication. All right, so face-to-face communication is basically uh, that type of communication when you can see the person and when you can directly interact with the person. When you can see the person and when you can directly interact with the person. When you meet someone personally and uh, interact with one another and have a conversation with one another, that is basically face-to-face communication. So in the process of face-to-face communication, verbal and non-verbal communication takes place. Both verbal and non-verbal communication takes place. Verbal communication takes place because you're using words to interact with one another, and non-verbal communication also takes place because you can see the other person, because you can see the facial expressions, you can see the gestures, you can see the body language of the person. So verbal and non-verbal communication takes place whenever you communicate with someone personally, whenever you can see one another, and whenever you communicate with one another when you sit in front of each other. So that is face-to-face communication. When you can see the face of the other person, that is basically face-to-face communication. All right, so these are some of the different types of face-to-face communication. The first one is interview. So personal interviews are those round of interviews where you have to meet the interviewer, you will have a conversation with the interviewer, and the interviewer can see you and you can also see the interviewer. So that is why personal interviews are regarded as face-to-face communication, because you can see one another and while having a conversation. Okay, now telephonic conversations are not face-to-face communication because you cannot see one another. You can just hear the voice, you can just listen to the voice, but you cannot see each other. So telephonic is not a face-to-face communication, whereas personal interviews are face-to-face communication because you can see one another. Then official meetings where you can see one another when personally all the members are present and they interact with one another. Conferences, official conferences, seminars, workshops, then classroom lectures, definitely you can see the teacher, you can the teacher can see the students. Then when you see a performance on the stage, when somebody is performing on the stage, and that is also a kind of face-to-face communication. Even public lectures are considered as face-to-face communication because you can see the person who is delivering the speech. All right, so these are the certain examples of, these are some of the examples of face-to-face communication. Okay, so these are some of the dynamics of face-to-face communication. So I will quickly explain you the dynamics of effective face-to-face communication. in face-to-face communication, at least two individuals, okay, should be physically and mentally present at the place of communication. So at least two, as we all know that in the process of communication, we at least need two individuals. There has to be two people who can interact with one another. So there has to be a sender and there has to be a receiver. So in case of face-to-face communication also, there has to be two people, there must be two people. One is the sender, another is the receiver. That is, one is the speaker or another is the listener. And they should be physically present. They must be able to see one another, and they must be able to communicate with one another properly. Okay. Next point is, in face-to-face communication, there should be proper encoding and with most appropriate and pleasing words by the sender. So as I had already mentioned that whenever you communicate, you use words. You use words and communicate. So in case of face-to-face communication, because you are having a conversation with the other person, so definitely you will be using words to communicate. You will definitely be also like your communication will also be dependent upon your facial expressions, your gestures, your posture, but it will also be dependent upon the words, isn't it? So that is why whenever you are basically interacting with someone, you must take care of the words. You must take care of the words or the sentences, and you must first think about it and then you need to tell. Okay, so that an effective communication can take place. Otherwise you might have certain misunderstandings, otherwise there might be a conflict at the end of the day. So that is why if you want to avoid these things, avoid these problems, avoid these issues, then you can just try to use the appropriate words and phrases in order to communicate effectively. Then the third point is, in face-to-face communication, there should be proper decoding by the receiver after receiving the message. Now, you are the listener, and if you cannot understand the actual meaning of the message, then again there will be some kind of misunderstanding, isn't it? So that is why it is very necessary to understand the exact meaning of the message. And if you have any kind of doubt, you can definitely ask the speaker again. If you can definitely ask the other person if you have any doubts, so that there's no misunderstanding, and both of you can communicate with one another effectively. The fourth point is, in face-to-face communication, uh, there should be some kind of response or feedback. So if you do not respond, being a listener, if you do not respond to the speaker, then the speaker will definitely not like to interact with you, or the speaker would not like to share any kind of information with you, and the speaker would also might feel offended. So that is why you should share your response or your feedback, so that the communication is effective, so that the communication is proper. So these are some of the dynamics of effective face-to-face communication. So is there any doubt regarding face-to-face communication? You can write it down in the chat box. You can also unmute yourself and ask me.